China says United States President Joe Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy will create divisions, incite confrontation, and destroy peace. Hello, I'm Arnold Maritime, and this is The Heat. U.S. President Joe Biden is on the final leg of his visit to Asia. During the trip, he unveiled his new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, a partnership with 12 other nations across Asia and Oceania. He's also meeting with members of the Quad, a security alliance which includes the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. China has responded strongly to these developments, saying the strategy is, quote, doomed to fail. We start with this report from CGTN's Phoebe Amoroso.
The two leaders said their meeting came during an increasingly precarious global security situation in the wake of Russia's actions in Ukraine. President Biden and Prime Minister Kishida pledged to strengthen their alliance and deterrence capabilities, voicing concerns over China. And these concerns extended to economic security. Biden announced the launch of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework with 13 other countries. Its aim is to counter China's economic influence in the region. Kishida has said Japan will sign up, but that it will keep petitioning the U.S. to rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a free trade pact that the U.S. walked away from in 2017. And he says the framework is not in Japan's interest.
Doesn't really do anything in terms of trade. There's no commitment to lowering tariffs. It's basically a framework that's focused on setting standards in terms of supply chains, in terms of digital technology. In that regard, clearly cooperation is needed, but I think the interests as they are in the region are more focused on actually lowering tariffs.
Some observers say the U.S. is going to have to offer more tangible benefits to win support for its strategy.
Analysts say the message from the latest summit is clear. Both leaders want to show that the U.S.-Japan alliance is stronger than ever. Phoebe Amoroso, CGTN, Tokyo.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C. is Jenny Town. She is a senior fellow with the Stimson Center and director of Stimson's 38 North program. From North Potomac, Maryland, Shihoko Goto is the director for Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise and the deputy director of the Asia program at the Wilson Center. From Beijing, China, Aina Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator, and also with us in the U.S. Capitol is Saurabh Gupta. He is the senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to all of you. Saurabh Gupta, let me start with you. President Biden is on the final leg of this visit, as I said, and ostensibly this visit is about shoring up security and promoting trade in the region. But what do you think the U.S. goals are?
The U.S. goals, as you said, are exactly those. I mean, it's about security, it's about trade, but it's fundamentally on both these fronts having a China minus strategy, trying to have a positive agenda for the region, but an agenda which does not include China within those frameworks. And that's why you have the Quad meeting, you have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where China can bear many of these responsibilities, but is not invited to be part of the group. So it's mainly to suggest to the Indo-Pacific region that the U.S. remains committed to the region. It has plans and strategies for the region, that they are framed with a positive cast of mind, but also the element that, well, China should not be part of these arrangements.
Saurabh, as you say, this is about security, this is about trade, but is it also a zero-sum game? One country has to have all the power, the others have to toe the line.
No, not exactly. I would say the Trump administration was going down that route. The United States, the Biden administration understands that it cannot be framed on those lines because it doesn't sit well with its Asian partners. It might sit well with a few Asian partners, but it needs the vast body of Asia to be on board many of its strategies and plans. And therefore, the idea is to frame what Kurt Campbell has said are bespoke strategies for the region. I think there are more not really complementary. They often contradict each other. But the idea is to frame a positive vision without always talking in terms of encirclement of China or anti-China. But when China is sort of built out from each of these strategies, that effectively is what it boils down to, frankly.
Jenny Town, South Korea signed on to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. In fact, it was the first country that signed onto the agreement. From South Korea's point of view, what's in it for Seoul?
Well, I think, the new president is really focused on building, rebuilding alliance cooperation and really building more regional cooperation. There's much less strategic ambiguity that's going on in this administration. They're much clearer about how they view North Korea and China, and the need to cooperate and build cooperation. I think it was a good sign for Biden to go to Korea and to Asia when he did, because I think there has been a lot of concerns that the U.S. is distracted right now because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. And this did give that impression that the U.S., can walk and chew gum at the same time, that they are still focused on Asia. They still understand the strategic interests, but, also calling on the region to be of more of a collective security mindset, both on the hard security issues as well as on the economic security side.
So, Jenny, South Korea and the United States have a very close relationship. Where does this kind of agreement take that relationship? How does it further it?
Well, I think, a lot of this actually started under President Moon. So even though there was strategic ambiguity, there was definitely a recognition that the alliance was maturing, that the alliance needed to grow, but that in order for the alliance to grow, there also had to be greater economic support and response in order to mitigate some of the influence that China does have on the economic side. So, I think it's unlikely that, South Korea is going to stop trading with China. But at the same time, it can't live under the constant threat of coercion that the Chinese do pose, especially for decisions that South Korea will make in its own security interests.
Shihoko Goto, I want to talk a little bit more about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Summit. I mean, there are some commentators and analysts who say that this new framework is the United States trying to create a new bloc to counter China. In fact, there was something that was written in China Daily, which I'm going to read to you. I'll quote to you. In fact, it was written by the British international relations analyst Tom Fowdy. He wrote, "While the United States exerts pressure on Southeast Asian countries to take sides against China and talks up its commitment to the region, in practice, it continues to view diplomatic relationships as a zero-sum game in its favor. These countries only matter to the United States to the extent they can be used to contain China." What do you make of that analysis?
Well, I have to say, there are two overriding objectives for the United States in coming up with this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. One is to mitigate the fact that it is not part of the CPTPP. Bear in mind that China has actually formally requested entry into this trade agreement. The United States, for domestic reasons, is not able to join, and there's really no appetite in Washington to join. At the same time, as you know, the region has not just the CPTPP, but RCEP as well. There are mega trade deals that are going on. The United States felt obliged really to come up with an economic leadership role that would allow it to come up with some new proposals that would secure its own economic interests. And that brings me to my second point and the second overall objective of Washington, and that is to say, to meet some of the economic goals that it has. And it's not necessarily about market access or tariff reduction. It really is about ensuring some of the economic weaknesses that have become very apparent during the pandemic in particular, supply chain fragmentation, reconsideration of value chains, issues that come about environmental protection, moving forward on digital trade. These are issues that the United States is very much focused on, and it would very much like to have a new framework to move forward, and it brings together like-minded countries in that direction.
And what do you make, Shihoko, of Tom Fowley's point that these countries only matter to the United States to the extent that they can be used by the United States to contain China?
I would actually argue that it really is not necessarily about China containment. Certainly, that is not what Washington wants to do. If it were simply about China containment, then it would readily include Taiwan. And it has not. Taiwan has really wanted to be part of this framework, but it really does want to be able to work together with countries that face similar challenges when it comes to efficiency and transparency in the markets.
Anna Tang, and of course there has been a response from China. Chinese officials have described the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy as a, quote, strategy that is doomed to failure. Facts will prove, they said, that the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy is essentially a strategy for creating divisions, a strategy for inciting confrontation, and a strategy for destroying peace. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, you have very, very different perspectives. You've heard the mainly American perspective on this, the Washington perspective, that this was somehow positive or not aimed at China. I think in Beijing, it's clearly aimed at China, and it's not very positive. On the other side, this whole thing, this framework is a non-entity. It's basically, as they say, a nothing burger. There's no real teeth to it. Even the Japanese said, well, you know, we don't understand this. If you want a real trade, alliance, let's get serious about joining the TPP or the former TPP. So it's not offering much, but it's, as usual, dictated by domestic politics. Biden is anxious as he is facing the worst polling of any president at this time in their presidency, period. So he wants to come to Asia, look strong, and kind of, say, oh, look, we're doing things in Asia. We're doing something. We can walk and chew gum. Mm-hmm. But, quite frankly, they passed over almost $44 billion over to Ukraine to support a war. They couldn't find $50 billion to help with end the pandemic with vaccines. And with ASEAN last week, I mean, it fell flat. He failed to meet individually with these heads of state who came to Washington, they thought, for some sort of engagement. Mm-hmm. So you see a lot of activity, but not a lot of substance. And that is bothersome to everybody because it's just not clear what the American strategy really is.
Right, and as you say, not much substance. So is this just about optics?
Well, I mean, yeah, you'd have to come to that conclusion because there was nothing that was actually done except this repudiation of strategic ambiguity. Once again, they're trying to walk it back. This is the third time in a number of months that he's come out and said this. Yes, this was definitely aimed at the domestic audience. He wants to play that Joe Biden is tough on China. But I don't know that the American public is even interested as they look in their pocketbooks and see the kind of inflation that they're facing.
Saurabh Gupta, as Anna Tangan tells us, there is not much of substance to this framework. And if we look at the numbers that have been presented by the United States, there might be some credence to that, because earlier this month, during the ASEAN summit, the U.S. pledging $150 million for the region's infrastructure, security, pandemic preparedness, and other efforts, as it was put. $150 million, in the general scheme of things, that's a minuscule amount if you compare it, say, to China's Belt and Road Initiative. How far is $150 million going to go? Is this just a token effort?
I think it's more, as Aina was saying, it's more optical illusion than the real deal. The problem with the framework is that there isn't any real consensus in the administration or in Asia as to just exactly what it is, and therefore they had to have some product. They've put out a product, and remember, this is negotiations are not being kicked off now that we have this framework. Consultations, discussions towards negotiations are. And you have parties like India out there which cannot sign up for at least 2, if not 3 of the 4 pillars, and perhaps not for any of the pillars. but an Indo-Pacific strategy without India would not be an Indo-Pacific. It wouldn't work for the Indo-Pacific. There are lots of issues related to this, but I would say, the Japanese have been pretty forward, aggressive in wanting America to be back in TPP, but I think to some extent their own worst enemy out here. Particularly, I'm talking in terms of Mr. Abe. When America stepped out of CPTPP, America, one of the reasons for that is it's hard to pass these things in Congress. And more or less, if they can just have a bilateral agreement with Japan, it effectively makes up for America's trade with all TPP partners. It has FTAs with 6 of the partners. Japan made up 95% of the trade with the rest. And then Mr. Abe delivered a U.S.-Japan agreement in which he gave America the terms that the U.S. would have to fight for in TPP in the agriculture sector. So basically, U.S. got what it wants from Japan in a bilateral agreement, and now it doesn't see a real reason to get back into TPP. So I don't think it was a terribly smart idea, and I don't think, of course, the U.S. is going to go back to TPP. And the main problem now that we have with this framework is that, yes, there are 12 parties, but all these other, or most of these other parties, are committed to existing regional conventional trade agreements.
Yeah.
And this framework is not complementary with them. So how do these things sit together? And so there are more questions than answers, frankly.
Chihoko Goto, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that it is a brave attempt by Washington to ensure that its rhetoric matches its actions. As I said before, one of the challenges had been America's own domestic hurdles of coming up to be able to rejoin CPTPP. It has come up with this framework. Until today, there was a lot of cynicism about any Southeast Asian nation actually signing on to it. We have actually seen a large number of Southeast Asian nations actually signing on to it. Yes, they are also members of the CPTPP, but it does reaffirm the fact that they are willing and wanting to align themselves with the United States, and they do share this common agenda of the 4 issues that the United States is also focusing on. And I think there is a great deal of excitement, especially when it comes to digital trade issues. And I think for a lot of countries, industrialized countries, coordination on supply chain efficiency and a mechanism where there is exchange of information about supply chain distribution and management will be incredibly useful. It is something that is not exactly a trade deal per se, but it does allow us to think about economic partnerships in a new way.
Jenny Tal, I just want to get back to the $150 million that the US has pledged for this framework agreement. I mean, wouldn't there be eyebrows raised and perhaps questions raised about the relative size of this commitment and also about the US commitment to the region?
Well, I think I agree with Chihoko. This was a beginning, a first step. I think it might have been a little bit prematurely laid out. But I think, the whole point was, this was about rule setting. This was about building cooperation and building cooperation that's value-based at a time when I think everyone's economies are really suffering coming out of the pandemic. And so I think it was a bit of, rhetoric and action, but in a way that takes it out of, for instance, say the Quad, which was originally security oriented. It made it something that is purely economic. And certainly I think we'll see it being fleshed out more as we go along. But so far it's more about building the apparatus, building the rules, building the foundation for future cooperation. It is, as everyone has said, it is not a trade deal in and of itself. And so getting this started and bringing in the different partners to gauge the interest to see what this could be, I think is part of the strategy here. So some optics, I think some in response to what we've been hearing in the region as well from countries like South Korea that have really tenuous relations with China when it comes to organizations like the Quad anyway, that does have that security backing. And so trying to build this in, I think, was a way to respond to that, as well as deal also with some of the optics on the U.S. economy as well.
Shihoko, Jenny mentioned the Quad. Of course, that's the security component of this visit. The Quad, of course, comprising the United States, India, Australia, and Japan. That summit is coming up. What's on the agenda? What do you expect will come out of that?
Well, it's interesting because we have come out of a pandemic, and actually issues regarding the pandemic will be in the back burner. It really will focus first and foremost about Ukraine and coordination of the four countries when it comes to pushing back against Russian aggressions in Ukraine. That will be first and foremost. The second will be implementation, of course, of the IPEF, the Economic Framework.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, it will be about meeting the China challenge and the tumultuous situation of the regional order that we face at the moment.
Anna Tang, and ahead of that Quad summit, the countries plan to announce a maritime initiative, that's what it was called, in which they say is aimed at curbing, quote, Chinese illegal fishing. Is that what this is about, Chinese fishing?
Well, I mean, in terms of Washington's idea of China, it's on all fronts. It's 180-degree, or I should say 360 degrees of attack. So fishing has been an issue. They're saying that they're going to muster their maritime forces in order to track Chinese fishing boats. I mean, this is definitely aimed at creating not only a PR idea that China is somehow, running around the seas fishing illegally as opposed to other nations out there, that China is the problem. But I don't necessarily accept this idea that this was positive or it's building or anything. It really looks like the U.S. is flailing. I mean, you brought up the 115 million that's to take care of everything throughout Asia, 44 billion for Ukraine. I think that speaks volumes about where the commitment is and what the U.S. is doing. They're throwing more money towards munitions. They're not throwing it towards economics. We are not coming out of a pandemic. We're still in a pandemic. That was said by the WHO yesterday when he gave his speech. And this kind of, well, everything's just fine, and we're life is going to get better and better and all that stuff. No, I don't buy it. There isn't a real strategy here except put China at the center of anything that's bad that's happening in the world, and hopefully everyone will agree with that.
Saurabh Gupta, President Biden will also be holding a bilateral meeting with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi that will take place on the sidelines of the summit, and that meeting is expected to focus on India's stance on Ukraine. What do you expect to happen there?
I don't expect much to happen there at all. I think the Western countries have put the pressure that they've needed to put. They've not got any traction on that. And they've frankly come to terms that India is not going to join in the language that they want India to put out vis-a-vis Russia. And frankly, they have now, let me frame it this way, India's position is the same as China's position, and India is maybe one step ahead of China in terms of purchasing discounted oil. But the rhetoric which is directed at China and the rhetoric which is now directed at India is completely polar opposite. We had von der Leyen, the EU head, come to India and say a lot of sweet things with regard to Ukraine and with regard to EU-India cooperation. And I expect the same thing out here, that Mr. Biden and Mr. Modi will have privately talked about Ukraine and that India, and they understand that India is not happy with this, but at the end of the day, India's position will remain just the same. It's not going to change.
Right, sir, but we also hear from the United States that when they don't get countries like India to agree with what they're doing, they warn of unspecified consequences.
There won't be any, I assure you. What happens is the unspecified consequences happen to countries which are weaker, smaller, and of course are not aligned. India is, fortunately or unfortunately, too strong or too important for the Indo-Pacific strategy for it to be sanctioned for purchasing Russian oil. or for purchasing Russian, the anti-defense missile system. Nothing's going to happen, I assure you.
Jenny Tan, President Yoon has expressed a desire to join the Quad. Do you see that happening?
I think they are set on doing it, but I do think there is some hesitation, of course, depending on how things go over the next couple of months. We've already seen threats coming from China of consequences for certain actions. And I do think, depending on how the U.S. responds to that, how the collective sort of responds to that kind of pressure will matter as to whether or not South Korea actually makes that decision to move forward.
Anna Tangen, I wonder, there'll be a new face at the Quad Summit. That's the new Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. He defeated the extreme right-winger Scott Morrison, and in this new, in the last election in Australia, of course, there were many Green Party members as well as independents who won. Do you think that will change the dynamics of the Quad at all?
Not really that much in terms of domestic politics. China is still, very, very low in terms of polling. There's a feeling that China's a problem, but among the business community, they're anxious to protect what they have. They also know that they're heading into very uncertain economic times. And at this juncture, I would expect him to be more balanced, less fiery rhetoric, but not really a big change in terms of policy.
Shioka, how does the Quad actually fit into the broader U.S. goal of pivoting to Asia?
It is instrumental. What the Biden administration has really been trying to do is to build on existing networks. So it's not taking away from a hub and spoke system, but it's trying to add more layers to it. So certainly the Quad is one layer to it. The AUKUS agreement is another part. This IPEF, the IPEF economic framework is another one. So in that respect, the Quad is an integral part. As Jenny said, it started off as a security mechanism, but it has evolved into something much broader. Of course, one of the biggest challenges is going to be to ensure that India remains a partner, a committed fourth country, and it's critical to actually meet India in its comfort zone and to listen to what extent India is able to give and meet the other three countries.
Okay, that's where we need to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.